What does one of the world's top loudspeaker designers do when given a budget, albeit a healthy budget? In some ways, the Borresen C3 is Michael Borresen's answer, his impressive answer. Over time, we're investigating several of the interesting loudspeakers in the $20,000 to $50,000 per pair range. We've done the Magico A5 and the Perlisten S7t and the Wilson Watt Puppy and the SoundLab G7 7C, to name a few. And there are more on the schedule, including today's subject, the Borresen C3, which is priced at $40,000 per pair. We realize that this price range seems rather elevated to some of you. To make our reasoning clear, we've found this to be a category where there are obvious gains in refinement over the next price ranges down. And we found this to be a price range where the gains from moving even further up in price aren't as obvious. It is perhaps important to understand why that seems to be the case, a complex subject which we'll just touch upon later. In any event, this price zone is an audible value sweet spot in our experience. As always, the gains offered in this category may or may not be important to you, something which will depend on your musical sensitivities and your overall system budget. The Borresen C3 will make that latter idea clear. For now, you might assume that we're talking about systems around the $100K or higher price range. You don't need to spend that kind of money to get a very good stereo system. Alternatively, you might want to, and be able to, go the extra mile, as it were. Stick with us if you're in the latter camp, and check out our other videos if you're in the former. All right. Let's talk about the design of the C3. The Borresen C3 is a medium-large floor-standing speaker at 56 inches tall by 15 inches wide by 22 inches deep. They weigh 150 pounds each. Sensitivity is 88 dB at 1 watt at 1 meter. Each complex cabinet is made from heavily braced wood panels with an outer skin of carbon fiber in selected areas. Special damped feet are provided on outriggers. The driver complement consists of a Borresen RP94 ribbon tweeter, which is 1 inch wide and 2.5 inches high. This operates from 2.5 kilohertz up. The mid-range is handled by a pair of Borresen DCC5 Neo 5-inch drivers using a carbon fiber sandwich cone and a low-inductance magnetic motor. For bass, 2 more DCC5 Neo drivers are brought to bear, so that the radiating area on hand is similar to a 10-inch woofer. The unusual loading is something between a sealed cabinet and a ported design. I talked to Michael Borresen at length about the design, as always, after listening was completed. His basic theme was low noise. To avoid excess confusion, distortion and noise are simply terms we use to define elements of the output of a device which are not present in the input. And we don't want those changes to the input. Distortion is often confused with the idea of harmonic distortion, so some designers avoid the term. Similarly, noise is often confused with self-generated active noise as with hiss generated by an amplifier. But if we can broaden our thought process to encompass all output signal elements that we don't want, then Borresen's goal of lower noise makes sense. He gives an example of the DCC5 cone design where he says they found in measuring various drivers that 2 drivers might easily have basically the same overall noise level, but one driver would have a noise signature that delayed some of its noise, while the other would have a less time-distorted signal. The latter is preferable and considered lower noise in listening, but requires special engineering. For low noise transient response, the tweeter diaphragm weighs only 0.01 grams. Now, if I could explain everything about the design, maybe some of you could figure out how it sounds. But I can't do that, and most of us need help connecting the technological and sonic dots. So, we listen and report. Therefore, let's talk about sound quality. I focus first on the standout qualities of products under review, especially for products above the entry level, where experience teaches that the product will be good on many parameters. I think you'll want to know what is truly special. If what's special doesn't light your fire, well, you can move on. So, standout quality number 1 with the Borresen C3 is spatial presentation. The C3 has a soundstage presentation and a sound space presentation that is close to the best I've heard as measured by the standard of believability. It's bettered by the Magico M7 and probably others in the 5x to 10x price range. But in practical terms, so what? Let's talk about the performance you get with the C3 relative to the absolute sound. As a reminder, soundstage is the apparent presentation of performers on a virtual stage. Sound space, on the other hand, refers to the presentation of the hall or the club or the auditorium where the performance takes place, or is virtually designed to take place. The C3 has a wide and deep soundstage that makes you realize that other references to wide and deep soundstage are often delimited by what we're used to with stereo, not with real music. With the C3, it was easy to place the speakers in a way that naturally opened up the angle to the stage while preserving center fill. This angle was more like concert hall sound than with most other speakers. At the same time, the sense of front-to-back positioning was excellent given the right recording. The icing on the cake is that the C3 does an excellent job with image height as well. Many speakers place the boundaries of the soundstage rather low, as if you're looking down at the stage. That, of course, can happen in some venues, but it seems more common to have the stage somewhat elevated, or at least level with one's eyes. The C3 achieves this, as do other excellent speakers I've reviewed, but it's rare. I'll add that the C3 excels at imaging coherence. What I mean is that performers don't seem to be glued to the speakers as often as with some other designs. This issue can often mean that left and right performers don't seem to be positioned on the stage per the recording. They seem to be positioned by the speakers, which disturbs the impression of believability. In addition, a lack of soundstage coherence with some other speakers can mean that left and right performers can seem to be consistently placed forward of the more central performers. This could, of course, be the case, but it's somewhat odd. Usually the vocalist, for example, has a central position and is forward of or in line with the supporting musicians. What I'm describing is a pattern where all too often speakers consistently present left and right performers on a plane forward of the central performers. The C3, on the other hand, is more consistent at presenting left, center, and right performers in believable locations, both left and right and front to back. I don't really find that music in concert has exact micro-positioning of performers, but I do find that their spatial zones aren't consistently locked down to a few positions. With the C3, performer zones can be presented naturally at left, left, center, center, right center, and so on. And front-to-back positioning is independent of left-to-right positioning. That's wonderful and relaxing. The sound space presentation of the C3 is closer to enveloping than with most other speakers. This varies from recording to recording, of course, but the C3 gives a sense of the environment that is excellent. If you think about how this is done on good recordings, it requires excellent small signal handling. Hall reflections, or reverb, are by definition small components of the fundamentals and harmonics of the instruments. Michael Borresen's comments on low noise design would seem relevant here. Now, for context, I do want to say that I have experience with some planar designs that present a bigger sound stage and sound space than the C3. The SoundLab G77C and the Alsavox Michelangelo just do space bigger. I'm not convinced that this bigness is more believable, but it can be impressive and might be closer to real music if it weren't for the occasional issues with coherence. My point is that there are trade-offs at this stage of the science, both the recording science and the acoustic science. The C3 balances these trade-offs very, very well. All right, let's talk about standout quality number 2, imaging outside the sweet spot. First, a brief thank you to our viewers who've mentioned that they sometimes like to listen in small groups. Based on this, my intent is to cover component performance in this area, subject to obvious limitations. Stereo, after all, by design, isn't really optimized for listeners outside the sweet spot. A core assumption of stereo is one of symmetry. The speakers form an isosceles triangle with the listeners, and the speakers are placed midway between left and right walls. The room boundaries are symmetrical, and so on. When you have a group of listeners, the symmetry assumption is basically violated. But we can still ask, what happens then? At a minimum, we can think of a concert performance where not all listeners are on the proverbial 50-yard line, and they work acceptably, if not perfectly. The Borresen C3 works surprisingly well when you sit off the central axis. I did my test listening for this seated 3 or 5 feet away from the sweet spot to the right. The soundstage still was presented mainly between the speakers, and the sense of performers in space was present. Sure, the performers weren't as well defined as when in the sweet spot, but it was enjoyable and not extremely far away from the distortions of seating far left or far right in a concert hall or a club. Now, I haven't always checked this in the past, so my references here are a bit thin, but the C3 is the best performer on this parameter that I can recall this side of the MBL 101. I wouldn't take that ranking to the bank, but if you care about this parameter, the C3 is a speaker you should hear. Standout quality, and question mark number 3, is voicing. The C3 is masterfully voiced, with one possible exception. Basically, an element that many speakers below this price point struggle with is something we call octave-to-octave balance. The idea is that bumps and dips in response that are fairly close together, within an octave or in the next octave up or down, tend to be perceivable and somewhat annoying. They are annoying for those of us familiar with the sound of real instruments because they tell your ear brain that the sound is not real. At the extreme, they're annoying because they generate an edgy or dull sound that distracts or kills the life of the music. Examples of this are edgy female vocals generated by peaks in the 2 to 4 kilohertz region, or percussion dynamics that fail to inspire because transients are sanded off. The C3 has very smooth octave-to-octave balance and thus sounds open and clear and natural and dynamic. At the same time, my sense is that the frequency response is not ruler flat. Of course, there's research indicating that you don't want ruler flat response, and essentially none of the speakers we've measured in the last 2 years are ruler flat. What may be more surprising is that the tone shaping among good speakers varies quite a bit, with plus or minus 5 dB variations between speaker models quite common. I conclude that this is where the science of speaker design transitions to the art of speaker design. Using the absolute sound as a reference, I view the C3 voicing as believable and convincing if you like detail and harmonic accuracy and transient response. If that description scares you, I need to add that the C3 seems to have a shallow depression in the 2 to 6 kilohertz region. So the detail on offer is, in my experience, based on resolution, not on peaky artifacts. I do think that the average recording is mixed a little too hot, which, together with the preference of listening panels for a slight downward tilt in frequency response, makes this voicing really sensible. I'll say that these voicing choices are subtle enough that I don't think most listeners would hear the sound as being tone-shaped. Rather, they'd say words like natural or lifelike or something like that. Now, we come to the one possible exception part of the voicing. The C3 rolls off slowly below 50 to 60 hertz. This isn't an artifact of my room because many speakers are flat to below 30 hertz in this room. So those of you who like deep, rich bass will find something missing on some of your music with the C3. Those of you who have a strong distaste for bass bloat and resonance will view the C3 as a dream speaker. It does 30 hertz, but at a reduced level. Okay, let's do a subjective coda. As you may recall, we aim to objectively observe what products do. The subjective part of how I feel as a reviewer is not a core part of our methodology because, well, I'm not you. There's more on this in our methodology FAQ. But naturally, some people would like my feelings as part of a picture of how the product performs. I invite you to ignore this if you're a stickler for objectivity only. I loved the Borresen C3. For my deep interest in comprehensive believability, it's among the best speakers I've heard. The soundstage presentation is transformative, and the mid-range voicing is genius. Again, for me. I happen to care a lot about bass, too. The C3 bass design would seem to be a showstopper here for people like me, except that I don't think you can get great bass with a two-box, meaning left and right speakers only, setup in any event. That's because you often need some kind of multi-woofer, multi-position approach to deal with inevitable room modes. something that two-box systems rarely can do simply because of acoustical reality. I have a custom listening room with 34 bass traps tuned specifically to the room, and I still want a multi-woofer, multi-location bass system for the win. Borresen is serious about this, so they have a dipole subwoofer called the Borresen Bass Module that would seem ideal for the C3. These are, unsurprisingly, expensive, and you probably want two. But my experience with dipole bass suggests that these plus the C3 might be wonderful when properly dialed in. I'll add that a multi-woofer system with conventional subs could be done for a small extra cost in the context of the system price I suggested was likely for a speaker like this. I'll be exploring this idea in a few months. In any event, this is a serious speaker, and serious attention to high-quality system design should be part of the prospective purchasers thinking about it. Normally, you would consider the right amplifier for speakers like these, and I'm suggesting that the bass architecture should be considered in the same way, and that the C3 allows for this rather nicely. Okay, let's summarize. As I said at the outset, this price range gets you some excellent performance from many of the major speaker companies. Every product involves trade-offs, and the Borresen C3 does as well. The C3 trade-offs are addressable. At the same time, the C3 succeeds on parameters that are very difficult and I think very important. So, color me impressed. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the Borresen C3 loudspeaker system. If you have, we invite you to come back and join us again. And thanks for watching.